Hello, everyone, again. Thank you for spending your Friday night here at the Mini Gallery of Underground Anti-Culture, thinking about Naeem Mohaiemen's Afsan's Long Day, The Young Man Was, and the important questions it poses to us. And thanks again to Joy Urso and to the gallery for inviting me. So this is happy to be here. I'm Kristin Plys, an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Toronto, and I'll be talking about the film from my perspective as a social theorist of the Global South, whose research focus is on left movements and the avant-garde in Pakistan during the 1970s. Given my particular focus as a theorist and historical sociologist, the talk will center on theoretical, historical, and political questions that the film raises about the left movements that animated much of the world of the 1970s. The 1970s were a critically important, yet ultimately tragic decade for the Global South and the political movements for the kind of liberation colonial independence promised, but failed to deliver by the latter quarter of the 20th century. Naeem Mohaiemen's Afsan's Long Day, The Young Man Was, reconstructs both the initial optimism and the eventual defeats of the 1970s Global South through a series of narratives. Some parts of the film focus on a particular state context, such as Germany or Bangladesh, others on global exchanges beyond the nation state, and the final scenes on stories of individuals and their local daily lives. As a whole, the film imparts a narrative of the history of the 1970s anti-imperialist left, and so I'll begin with the histories and ideas of the movements and events that structure the narrative in the film. Before we discuss the historical narrative of the film, I want to begin by providing some background on the ideas that coalesced in the 1970s Global South. So I'll start with a discussion of what constitutes third worldist thought and place an emphasis on the distinction between non-aligned versus anti-imperialist movements, politics, and ideas. The third world, as historian Vijay Prashad specifies, is not a place, but a political project. Theories of the third world animated the anti-imperialist left of the 1970s. Initially forged in the battle against colonialism, theories of the third world asserted a near future that would be more just and equal. At the start of the 1970s, there were four competing strategies to realize the justice and equality that independence from colonialism promised, but as yet failed to deliver. Newly independent countries could choose among the following four options: alignment with the United States, alignment with the Soviet Union, non-alignment, and anti-imperialism. In the context of the Cold War, there were firstly states in the Global South that aligned with either the US-led capitalist developmental project or secondly, Soviet-influenced authoritarian socialism. The non-aligned movement, a third strategy, was a reaction against both US and Soviet strategies of economic development. K.D. Konda, president of Zambia in the 1960s, said of his country's policy of non-alignment, "This does not mean that we wish to be isolated from the rest of the world, nor does it mean that we practice neutralism. What it does mean is that we wish to make our own assessment in matters which affect us, and having done so, to be able to make our decision without pandering to any nation or bloc." While non-alignment was important as a continued assertion of formerly colonized countries to determine their own political futures, and as such was a threat to former colonial powers, left critics of non-alignment saw no honor in refusing to take sides when neo-imperialism limited the ability of revolutionary third worldism to take root. Said Muammar Gaddafi, and more on him later, of the non-aligned movement, the world is made up of two camps, the liberation camp and the imperialist one. There is no place for those who are non-aligned. We are not neutral and totally aligned against the aggressor. Long live the liberated, down with imperialism. In its left incarnation, third worldism was, in the words of French political scientist Gérard Chaliand, a rejection of capitalism by way of colonization. Colonial capitalism created new social classes to dominate workers and peasants across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. As Guyanese historian Walter Rodney saw it, colonial capitalism was left untouched by independence movements, as most leaders of newly independent states were frankly capitalist and shared fully the ideology of their bourgeois masters. In puzzling through the implications of how the United States as a world power and the international state system writ large limited the ability of newly independent states to realize the more revolutionary goals of movements for decolonization, psychoanalyst Frantz Fanon famously asked, Was it truly worth the effort to fight colonialism if all that changed was a domestic capitalist class now exploited workers and peasants instead of a European capitalist class? Despite the doubts expressed in this important question, Fanon remained optimistic. What he termed the Third World Project rejected the notion of catching up to Europe and North America, and instead endeavored to innovate a new way of thinking. Fanon believed in the creativity of this revolutionary leftist third world, that new forms of politics could be envisioned and enacted that would finally provide solutions to the long-standing social problems inherited from centuries of colonial rule. Third worldism for the left was not just a rejection of capitalist imperialism, but an assertion of creativity that would not just envision, but also enact a more just and equal world. The historical narrative of the film begins in part 2, prison, with the imprisonment of leaders of the Rote Armee Fraction, or RAF. More specifically, we see photos of Jean-Paul Sartre's visit to Stammheim prison to meet with RAF leader Andreas Baader. Based in Berlin, Germany, the RAF was perhaps on the surface a continuation of 1968 New Left movements across Europe and North America in its sexual and identity politics. But what made the RAF unique, mostly as a result of Ulrike Meinhof's theoretical genius, was the inspiration the RAF drew from third worldist social theory, particularly thinkers such as Mao Zedong, Frantz Fanon, Mohaiemen, and Che Guevara, in addition to European theorists such as Antonio Gramsci and Herbert Marcuse. While the feeling of possibility of colonial independence and the resurgence of the left permeated early 1970s Global South, the RAF was enacting a complementary critique of Western imperialism, but coming from within the West. Not only is the RAF globally interesting in the context of the 1970s as one of a handful of examples of Western movements inspired by the Global South left, other examples might be the Black Panther Party in the United States and the Brigate Rosse in Italy, but it's also important because of its antecedents and afterlives. The RAF's double critique of Nazism and its mundane persistence in the post-war period, along with the critique of colonialism and empire, predates contemporary conversations around colonial genocide of the Herero in German Southwest Africa as a so-called trial run for the Holocaust, but nonetheless draws important linkages between fascism and empire. However, the entirety of the next part of the film, part 3, Regret, is dedicated to Green Party members who tried to distance themselves from their RAF past. The tensions between the afterlives of the 1970s German far left and present politics proves untenable, as the RAF members who were not killed in prison decades later became involved in the decision to support NATO and US imperialist wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So cracks in US world power began to show after its historic defeat in Vietnam in 1975. This US defeat in Vietnam should have provided openings for third worldist ideas to flourish, but erstwhile democratic states across the Global South began to succumb to authoritarianism like dominoes. The transition from democracy to authoritarian rule in the late 1970s transformed the Global South from national liberation states with a commitment to democracy into states that ruled former colonial subjects by force, denying them the very rights and dignity that they had in the decades immediately preceding the 1970s, fought for and won. The Third World authoritarian moment of the latter half of the 70s erased much of the initial optimism about possibilities for so-called development and progress after independence, whether measured as equality or economic growth. But to the Third World, this authoritarian moment of the 1970s illustrated that the realities of the global post-war social compact were quite different from its promises. In this moment, the veil of development and freedom from colonial rule was lifted to reveal that dictatorship is not the exception to capitalist modernity, but in fact, the very essence of capitalist modernity as seen from its dependent peripheries. The national liberation state turned authoritarian typically cracks down on left critics as one of the first orders of business, or even becomes authoritarian in order to silence left critics who push the national liberation leader, now head of state, to enact and embody the justice and equality promised by the national liberation struggle. In the historical context of the 1970s, Maoists and students who were protesting the war in Vietnam are among the first who have this taste or are like exposed to this violent repression of the authoritarian state. So Maoism had this particular resonance in the late 1960s and through the 1970s as a left critique of Marxism, and this is typified in movements such as the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, the student uprisings of May 1968 in Paris, the Black Panther Party in the United States, the RAF, and so on. But outside of China, perhaps, no other world region had a stronger Maoist current than South Asia of the 1970s. Maoist thought helped to explain dependent development stemming from the expansion of capitalism from Europe to the rest of the world through colonialism and other processes, but a more encompassing concept of uneven development than Marxism-Leninism. As French philosopher Louis Althusser put it, Mao puts it in a phrase as clear as the dawn: nothing in this world develops absolutely evenly. It does not concern imperialism alone, but absolutely everything in this world. Maoism was particularly well suited not only to describe capitalism as seen from the global south, or as American literary critic Frederick Jameson proclaimed, Maoism was the richest of all the great new ideologies of the 1960s. Maoism became an animating ideology for much of the globe, but particularly for mid-20th century third worldism. In Mao's conceptualization of the third world, he sought solidarity with Asia, Africa, and Latin America against the capitalist imperialism of the first world and the social imperialism of the second world. Maoism then was an alternative that promised both national liberation and global economic justice, along with the possibility of asserting the agency that colonialism and capitalism had long denied the global south. As such, Maoism was not just suited to critique European imperialism and uneven capitalist development, but could also help make sense of the fact that decolonization and neocolonialism were taking place at the very same time. Maoism showed that the end of the old imperialism meant the end of one kind of domination, but independence brought with it new forms of domination, symbolically something like the replacement of the British Empire by the International Monetary Fund. Through its particular theorization of capitalism, imperialism, and class struggle, Maoism provided explanations for the transition from underdevelopment as a result of colonialism, imperialism, to continued underdevelopment after national independence. General Secretary of the CPIML, which was India's Maoist party, Charu Mazumdar, sided with and offered support to Maoists in Bangladesh against the wishes of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese sided with their long-standing ally Pakistan against what they termed Indian aggression in Bengal. Mohammad Toha, the General Secretary of the East Pakistan Communist Party Marxist-Leninist, which was soon to become Bangladesh's Maoist party, exchanged letters with Charu Mazumdar, who wistfully wrote of a singular Maoist struggle across all of Bengal. The Bangladesh question became a major point of contention for the leadership of India's Maoist party because it forced party leaders to think beyond the partition borders of 1970s India to the global peasant struggle. And while those sympathetic to Maoism might want history to show Maoists united across borders, Maoist leadership in China supported the Pakistani army, a faction of Indian Maoists were unconcerned with developments beyond India's border, and so despite help from Charu Mazumdar and other cadres who seized the opportunity that this influx of refugees and a relatively open border allowed for cross-national solidarity, Maoists in Bangladesh were left relatively isolated from global Maoism. So while the movements inspired by Maoism in Bangladesh and across the world were successful in describing and critiquing global capitalist imperialism of the 1970s, the global left ultimately failed to achieve its objectives. The shared global ideology of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism led in the 1970s to similar processes in far-flung corners of the globe, but what did these movements achieve? Would scrapping it all and starting over be the way to liberation that the 70s global left failed to realize? Or is there a lesson in documenting and analyzing left movements so that we don't repeat its missteps and mistakes? I read Afsan as a metaphor for the 1970s left. The left, like Afsan, is intertwined with, but also disconnected from, the national independence movement because the very same personalities who led a territory to independence were then constrained by global capitalism, but also constrained their own citizens through authoritarian politics. Afsan is aware that he is dying, but he thinks to leave behind a personal memoir to explain the 1970s left to himself, but also, I think, to us as viewers. If you recall, the first part of the film concluded with a group of 1970s South Asian leftist men trying to make sense of how their revolutionary dreams failed to become a future reality. The narrator recounts their hypotheses for the failed movements. The historical moment was not right, organizational weakness, we didn't study enough Marx and Lenin, we never understood dialectical materialism. But nonetheless, the narrator still deems the 1970s the what-if moment of the last century. Afsan's Long Day, therefore, is perhaps that very what-if moment of the 1970s, and the man that was is perhaps the animating ideologies of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, of which only a specter remains. Now that our discussion of the historical narrative of the film is complete, but how do we go about making sense of this history? When we set out to analyze the historical narrative of the film, it raises the question of meta-theory of the third world. So meta-theory is theory about theories, so third world meta-theory would be theories about theories of the third world. So to put the question in another way, what is the film doing as a work of art that puts forth a theory of the 1970s global left? Answering this question, I'm going to look to three theories of how art can serve revolutionary politics. First, we'll look to French philosopher Jacques Rancière's theory that art presents us with fragmented histories, which can either be a critique of capitalism by mirroring the chaos of the global economy, or it can be nihilistic by portraying that chaos as disconnected from capitalism. Then we'll delve into German social theorist Herbert Marcuse's contrasting theory of the radical potential of art, that the aesthetics of art transport us to an alternate reality through which we can not only better understand our own reality, but also better critique it. And finally, I'll delve into Mao's theories of art and art criticism. Mao contended that artists should inspire the masses to protest through the artist's superior understanding of left theory, and that the critic should judge a work by whether, first of all, the artist displays a deep understanding of left theory, and secondly, whether the work inspires the viewer to join the struggle. In representing what Rancière calls fragmented stories of erratic destinies, the artist shows, through the illogicality of the story, the logic of capitalism. Fragmented narrative structures in art, Rancière contends, can either be rooted in exemplary political awareness of the contradictions of the social order, or they can be reactionary nihilism. Fragmentation, or what Rancière calls pictorial carnivalization, can be used to describe the chaos of the capitalist world system, or it can portray that chaos as merely one element of the hedonistic chaos of the world. There's no fixed criteria for reading meaning into the chaos of a succession of juxtaposed images and of narratives. So as Rancière says, politics has its aesthetics and aesthetics has its politics. While Rancière points to the radical potential of art that conveys fragmented histories, his view is ultimately not very optimistic about art's ability to definitively serve anti-capitalist politics. Herbert Marcuse, on the other hand, is more optimistic about the radical potential of art. However, just as it is for Rancière, the politics of art is, as Marcuse sees it, not obvious, but instead inexorably indirect, mediated, and frustrating. Political art should not hit the viewer over the head with its political content. Instead, the politics of art for Marcuse is located within aesthetics. The inner logic of a work of art proposes to the viewer another reason, another sensibility, which defy the rationality and sensibility incorporated in the dominant social institutions. The transcendence of immediate reality shatters the reified objectivity of established social relations and opens a new dimension of experience, rebirth of rebellious activity. Through opening this new dimension of experience, art creates a counter-consciousness for the viewer that negates what Marcuse terms the realistic conformist mind. While the work of art is a product of its society and its time, it transcends time and social context through its aesthetic content, by rendering an alternate reality. This alternate reality reveals truths about the social world beyond a particular space and time. The truth of art lies in its ability to break with established reality, and in so doing, rethinking what is real. In the words of Marcuse, art is an historical alternative, a utopia to be translated into reality. Furthermore, claims Marcuse following Lenin, engagement with the alternate reality that art projects has the potential to create human happiness, and just thus the joy of engaging the political through experiencing art is an important form of praxis. Or as Marcuse put it, the revolution is for the sake of life, not death. Here is perhaps the most profound kinship between art and revolution. Perhaps it makes sense, given the content of the film, to end our discussion on meta-theory with Mao. Mao contended that artists should typify the contradictions of society and produce works which awaken the masses, fire them with enthusiasm, and impel them to unite and struggle to transform their environment. One could certainly make an argument that Naeem Mohaiemen's film does, as Rancière says, portray the chaos of global capitalism through fragmented histories, or presents, as Marcuse theorizes, an alternate reality that reveals truths beyond space and time, or, as Mao contended, reveals foundational social contradictions. While there are several lenses through which to analyze how he does it, Mohaiemen presents the viewer with a meta-theory of the third world of the 1970s. And now to make this discussion of meta-theory slightly more meta, Mao also prescribed a role for the art critic. Mao asks us to assess artistic work based on whether it has a unity of motive and effect. In other words, Mao believed that the motive of the artist should be rooted in a deep understanding of historical materialism, and that the work produced by the artist should compel the viewer to dissent and resist. Any work of art, therefore, should be analyzed based on both the intent of the artist and the effect the work has on the viewer. I want to conclude this talk on those terms by assessing whether Mohaiemen's meta-theory of the third world compels us to action or to nihilism. So now we've gotten through this deeper understanding of the history, and we've analyzed the film using a bit of philosophy. So now let me take just a few more minutes to conclude and explain why I think all of this matters. In the 18th Brumaire, Marx writes that history happens first as tragedy and then as farce. This question of how history repeats itself is the central theme of the film. In showing the failures of the 1970s anti-imperialist left to bring about liberation for much of the world, we then, in the present context, are forced to grapple with the afterlives of this failed left that live on through third worldism and Maoism as a tragic joke. Tragic in that its demise in the early 1980s put an end to the emancipatory hope the anti-imperialist left represented, and farcical in that this left fails to learn from its past mistakes, becoming a caricature of what it once was. These failures provide openings for fascism, both Western neo-imperialism and right-wing Islamist movements alike, to lead the way into the future instead of the more liberatory politics of the left. So why does this history matter? The political work to be done after engaging with this film is to take up unanswered and perhaps unanswerable questions, such as what did the 1970s left third worldism and Maoism achieve? Would scrapping these traditions and starting over be the way to liberation the 1970s promised but failed to deliver? Or is the project of documenting, analyzing, and working from the afterlives of Maoist movements of the 1970s a way forward? The fact that this film was made seems to suggest that the filmmaker believes this project of documenting, analyzing, and working from the afterlives of left histories is a useful endeavor. As Jacques Derrida's concept of hauntology suggests, Marxism is the ghost whose expected return repeats itself again and again. Furthermore, that recurring return is not solely a reappearance, but also each time a beginning. Derrida reminds us that both the Manifesto and Hamlet begin with the return of a specter, for example. Just as Marcellus in Hamlet asks Horatio to question the ghost that appears at the beginning of the play, so too, Derrida pleads, we must not only speak to the ghost of Marx, or Mao in this case, but call it, interpolate it, interrogate it, to question the thing that it still is. So to rephrase this in another way, we're here in 2020 thinking about the 1970s and trying to figure out what aspects, if any, of the left movements and the intellectual thought that animated those movements remains helpful and relevant for us in 2020. This ghost of the past continues to weigh on us in the present, and it's up to us to engage with it, to examine what it is, and to determine what it offers for left movements today. So I hope that in posing these questions, we can respond to Mohaiemen's provocation of what is to be done, specifically this question of how in our contemporary context to animate global South movements against capitalist imperialism. So that's it for me. I'm really looking forward to watching the film with all of you. And I'm very grateful to be here tonight with all of you to have this conversation.